I did not get the homework assignment posted. I will get it posted before I go to bed tonight. That's about as definitive a time frame as I can get you, but I will get it posted today. It's not gonna be hard, but you do have to do it because it will count for a grade. It'll be 20 points, so that's roughly a test grade. Get it done. I lose it. Maybe caffeine will help. Okay, so this next section, and we're kind of back to politics. Don't like politics, but you got to get through it. It's manifest destiny. I'm sure you have all heard the term manifest destiny before. That is that idea that we were destined by God to push across the continent, maybe even beyond that, but at least push across the continent. And it was given the name Manifest Destiny by a New York newspaper editor, John O'Sullivan. He was a newspaper editor and Democratic Party propagandist. And what he wrote was, quote, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." That's going to be on a slide like 3 in, but we start with manifest destiny. I don't know why I didn't have the definition at the beginning. What I have at the beginning is Tyler becoming president. So if you remember the last election we talked about, it was Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, the log cabin and hard cider campaign of William Henry Harrison. Sorry, I knew he had 3 names. And President William Henry Harrison took office in 1841. He was elected because he was a military hero. You know, he defeated the Indians at Tippecanoe, and he was vague enough and unknown enough that no one hated him. You know, he didn't take a stand on any issues. He was going to be basically the Whig figurehead, or at least that was the plan of Daniel Webster and William Henry Clay, the right names. Clay stayed in the Senate to influence there, and Webster was going to be his Secretary of State. Unfortunately, William Henry Harrison wasn't all that healthy. And he gave his inauguration speech on a rainy day. He walked home from the White House, got pneumonia, and died on April 4th, 1841, about a month after he was inaugurated. He has the shortest term of any president. And the vice president is now going to step up. Well, if you didn't know where William Henry Harrison stood on issues because he was vague, Tyler did not have that issue. John Tyler was a Southerner. He was a Jacksonian. He was a states' rights man. He was a strict constitutionalist. And no one really wanted him to be president. They only put him on the ballot because they wanted the Southern vote. That's a dangerous game to play because things happen. People die and people become president. So Tyler ascends to presidency. He and Henry Clay don't agree. Clay is basically running the Whig Party at the time. Tyler is in name a Whig. He really is more of an old Republican, but he had been a Democrat, but he parted ways with Jackson over the whole states' rights issue. He just hated Jackson because Jackson vetoed the whole nullification idea. So the Whigs, with Clay in the lead, wanted to repeal the Independent Treasury Act. They wanted to repeal that because they wanted to establish a third national bank. And then they want to take the money that they're going to get from land sales that are going to go through the bank and distribute the money to the states. And they also want higher tariffs. Those were their plans. Tyler doesn't want any of this, except he agrees to get rid of the independent treasury because he doesn't believe in it. Not because he wants to help Clay get his national bank, but hey, you want to get rid of the treasury? That's fine with me, but I'm going to veto your bank. So he goes along with it, like, I'm going to go along with the plan until they actually pass the bill to create the bank, and then Tyler vetoes it. So now we don't have a treasury or a bank, and we're back to using state banks for federal money. And Clay up to this point has been the great compromiser, but Tyler manages to push his buttons, and he loses that ability to actually compromise. So Tyler does help repeal the Treasury Act. He does actually sign a higher tariff law. That was something he was against, but he did let that pass. He vetoes the National Bank. After he vetoes the National Bank, Clay has had enough. And Clay convinces everybody in Tyler's cabinet to resign. And everybody resigns except for Webster. Daniel Webster keeps his spot as Secretary of State. One, because Secretary of State has proven to be the position that you get hoisted to the presidency from. And Webster has presidential aspirations, but so does Henry Clay. But having his cabinet resign really doesn't hurt Tyler, because now Tyler can appoint people he wants. He can appoint people who think like him. But he's a man without a party. So he's definitely going to be a one-term president, because at this point, nobody wants to touch him. And all of this is happening during that economic depression that started in 1837. So really, nobody cares about the infighting between Tyler and Clay. Most people are just trying to keep their heads above water. Unemployment is soaring. Banks are failing. Politics is not really on the minds of most people in the country. But, it's still happening, and the government is not doing a lot to ease the situation. Possibly, had they established a national bank, they could have stopped the banks from failing, or at least, kind of ebbed the flow, but that didn't happen. In foreign affairs, Tyler has some things to deal with, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. Tensions with Great Britain are mounting again. We go back and forth between liking the British and not liking the British. We have some border issues up in Canada. But our biggest problems are at sea. The British have outlawed slavery at this point. And they are monitoring, patrolling, whatever you want to call it, along the coast of Africa to prevent slave ships from leaving Africa, even though it's really not, it's not a British territory, but they are. And in 1841, they threatened to board a U.S. ship off the coast of Africa to hunt for slaves. And by this point, we have also outlawed slave trade from Africa. The slave situation, slaves are actually now coming from within the country through natural growth. But technically, on paper, we're not importing any more slaves. You know, that's also technically on paper. The slave trade hasn't stopped. Later that same year, on a ship, a slave ship that, you know, we're not supposed to have a slave ship, but, you know, theoretically they could have been moving the slaves from one part of the South around by ocean to Louisiana or to Texas. But the slaves revolted on a ship called the Creole. They mutiny, and they take the ship to Nassau in the Bahamas, which is a British colony, where the British immediately set them free. Well, that doesn't sit well with the slave owners in the South and causes an international incident. And it's going to drag on until 1853, when Britain finally pays $110,000 for the slaves. On the positive, Webster, as Secretary of State, manages to work out a treaty with Britain, with their minister Ashburton. They work out the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, which establishes the border, the northern border, the way you see it on this map. Going up this way, so this green area was one of the things that they discussed, and they don't mark it over here, but there was an area here that was also in question, where we claimed up above, they claimed down below. We settled somewhere in the middle. We actually, as far as land, if you just look at the numbers, we got 7/12 of the contested land, so a little more than half. But it sets all of the northern boundaries except for Oregon, and we're going to fight for Oregon in a little while. It also established joint naval patrols off of Africa. So I guess if you can't beat them, join them. So now we're going to help patrol and keep the slave trade from continuing out of Africa. But manifest destiny is the big issue of this time. That economic depression I mentioned is one of the factors. You know, if you can't find work, you can't, your land is getting weak because you keep growing cotton on it and it won't grow good, move west. And that was the message from John Sullivan. That's the message from a lot of people. Now, this area they're moving west in, and this westward movement has been an ongoing process. We landed in Chesapeake on the East Coast. We've been moving west ever since we landed. The frontier just happens to be that next section. And now now we have moved to the middle of the nation, and we're moving across the Great American Desert. And as has happened before, that land is already occupied. It was occupied when we landed in Chesapeake. and we just keep pushing those people right in front of us. This time, however, not only are you going to deal with Indians, and these are the Indians that you guys probably think of when you think of Indians: Comanches, Apaches, the Sioux, the Nez Perce, the Western tribes. There were probably over 200, they estimate there were over 200 different tribes living west of the Mississippi in 1840. Around 325,000 people. Some were nomadic, some were agricultural, some were hostile, some were not. Many were hostile towards other Indian tribes, as well as to incoming people. There were also Spanish, or not Spanish at this point, they're Hispanic, people of Spanish descent. And Mexico is having its own issues, or Spain, because Spain and Mexico are having their own issues at this time. The early 1800s are not a good time for the Spanish Empire. They're starting to lose control. They're vastly overstretched for their resources. The Spanish efforts at colonizing Arizona and Texas were not as successful as they were in New Mexico and Florida. California is even a whole nother bag of worms for the Spanish, because it's a little, you get to deal with the coastal region, and the whole reason that Spain even went into California was to keep the Russians out. Russian seal hunters had been coming down the coast, and so they claim California and that area as part of an effort to keep the Russians out of, I guess they figured they're going to come all the way down. But the occupants of these areas are starting to get tired of Spanish control. In 1807, a Creole priest named Miguel Hidalgo led an unsuccessful revolt, but it plants the idea that maybe Mexico should be independent of Spain. And even though he is captured and executed in 1811, the idea hangs on. And by the 1820s, the Mexicans are able to pull Mexico from Spain and win their independence. With Mexico in control, the whole area opens up. So we're talking from, where Mexico is now, up through Texas, all the way over to the green. And I know people online can't see the green, but up to Oregon, Indiana, all the way to the coast. So Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, all of that is now under Mexican control. And us arrogant Americans rush in. It opens up the fur trade, and it opens up some settlement. The Rocky Mountains, now Oregon is still ours and Britain's, but the fur trade thrives there in the 1820s and 30s. By the 1840s, it's starting to fail, mostly because they kill off all the beaver. Beaver are the big fur, well, I guess they're not a big fur item. They're kind of a little fur item, but that was the marketable fur item, as well as buffalo and deer, but beaver were what you were really getting the money for at this point. And the way the fur trade worked, you would have mountain men who would go out, hunt the beaver, and then once a year they would meet at what they called the rendezvous. It's a French word for meeting place. It was usually somewhere near the Grand Tetons, and they would sell their hides, get new supplies, party, drink, have a great time, and then they would go back up into the mountains. If any of you have ever seen, I think it was Revenant, that was a pretty good depiction of what a mountain man's life was like. Some of them were even more solitary. There are some real characters in our history when you get into the mountain men. There was one that he always left in the spring with a wife. He never came back with her. And no one could figure out what he was doing until one year when he came back with a leg. Just the leg, because that's all he had left. When things got tough, she was food. We don't do well with cannibalism in our country, so he was kind of shunned after that, but it happens, and we'll talk about it again as we start moving west. But the fur trade is one of the big items in the West. And like I said, by the 1840s, it's going to start failing. But these explorers are going to spread the word just by word of mouth. You know, when they come down to the rendezvous, they talk to people. You know, the people who are selling them goods are not mountain men. They're not going to go back up into the woods. They're going to go back to the United States and sell off their hides. You know, it's a trade system. And when they do, they're going to tell stories of these beautiful places that the mountain men are telling them about, like the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is fertile, has lots of grass, has a river, would be a great place to live if you wanted to farm it. And people are going to start hearing these things and think, hey, maybe we should try it. Oregon fever takes hold around 1840. And in 1841, the first wagon trains start going west. California is another place that they're going to settle. It's going to get its big push with the gold rush. In 1848, and that's on the next slide, kind of towards the bottom. But California has been highly settled because the Spanish have come in earlier. They set up missions and presidios starting in the 1700s. So the Spanish system, as we've talked before, they would set up a fort, a presidio, and a few miles away they would set up a mission. The fort was supposed to protect the mission. The mission is supposed to convert the Indians. Basically, it just enslaved them, and they would farm and create, make things that then the church would sell. And the church had these big, huge estates. And in exchange, they're supposed to be taking care of the Indians, converting them, giving them religious instruction. They gave them instructions. It wasn't always religious. There were over 20 missions established in California, and they were all about a day's ride apart. That's how early towns were settled like in Texas. If you'll notice, towns are set up for different reasons. Like you go from here to Rowena, to Miles, to Ballinger, is that right? I always get Rowena and Ballinger back. That's because you had to have water stops for the railroad. The only reason Rowena and Miles exist is because they were water stops for the railroad. San Angelo to Ballinger was a 2-day trek. Eden to Brady, 1 to 2 days hard ride. All the towns are set about that far apart. It makes travel easier. In California, it was about a day. These missions lasted longer in California than they had in Texas and New Mexico. And they're going to last pretty much until Mexico takes over. They last through the Spanish colonial period. When Mexico takes over, the Mexican ranchers look at all this land that the church is holding and say, hey, we want that. And they convince the Mexican government to replace the church with rancheros, and which basically it's just for the poor Indians, it's just their masters change. Instead of serving the church, you're now going to serve whoever's running the ranch. But there's a lot of settlement already there. A lot of the land is already owned. But when the gold rush starts, you're going to get a lot of people coming in. And I know I've gotten way out of order on the slides, but that's all right. By 1845, there's about 5,000 people annually coming into California. By 1848, up that to about 30,000. And the gold is found by an immigrant from Switzerland. I think he's Swiss. He's either Swiss or Swiss. Yeah, he's Swiss. Who convinces the Mexican government he's going to make a Swiss community. Yeah, he's either Swiss or a Swede. I think he's Swiss. Sutter. It's Sutter's Mill. He never brings in the immigrants, but he finds gold. And he left his homeland because he was about to get in jail for indebtedness. The Santa Fe Trail is also an area that opens up after the Spanish lose control. The Spanish didn't really want to trade with the U.S. They wanted to keep us at arm's length. Mexico doesn't have those qualms. And the Santa Fe Trail flourishes after 1821. And the Santa Fe Trail is going to set the pattern for westward movement. They would go from St. Louis to Santa Fe, and they would go in caravans. One person crossing that area alone isn't safe. If you can put 10 wagons together, there's safety in numbers. And that pattern is going to hold as settlers start moving west, not just traders. It was traders that were going to Santa Fe. Santa Fe was the big New Mexico capital. There was a lot of trade there. But settlers are also going to take this same tactic of taking multiple wagons as they move west. And I think we talked that wagons are not nearly as big in reality as they look on TV. Especially if you watch the old Westerns. The bed of a wagon is maybe half again as big as this desk. Or like the desk that y'all are using, maybe twice as big. Now, you have to pack, and you could probably pack it about as deep as that desk is from the floor. After that, you're going to have to strap it down. So imagine packing everything you have in your dorm room in that area. Everything you own has to go in a box the size of your desk. Plus, you have to have enough food and water and fuel and tools and extra equipment to go west. And you have to get it all in that wagon. And you can't really, maybe a family has 2 wagons, usually 1. You don't get to take a whole lot west. So when you see these old pictures where they have a piano, and you wonder, why did they drag the piano out in the front yard to take a picture of it? they're damn proud of that piano. They worked hard to get that piano out west. That's important. And you taking pictures back then, you had maybe 3 pictures made in your life. You know, one when you were born, when you got married, and when you died. I always took pictures of the dead people. If you're going to spend the money on a picture, you're going to get everything important in that picture. So you drag the piano back out. And they had to be taken outside because flash, it was just hard to do with flashes. But it's hard. It's harder than you think. And there's an old, and I've been trying to think of it for 2 days. There's an old game, and you can play. Is it Oregon Trail? I thought it was Oregon Trail.
You die of dysentery like every 5 seconds.
Yeah, actually, my daughter and I played it one day just for grins, and we made it. Of course,
I've never been. That's okay.
We started out with 5 people in our wagon train, and like two of us made it to the end. I just kept changing who I was because like poor Sam broke his leg 3 times and then he got swept away in a flood.
Infection, dysentery.
Yeah, infection. Actually, if y'all want to find that game online, play it.
They've made a new one. I think it's an app, Oregon Trail.
Okay.
There's actually a new version. But it's
Okay, well, we
still
found the computer version. Either version, if you can find a version of Oregon Trail and play it, you got to get all the way to the end. So if you die of dysentery 5 seconds in, start over and do it again. Play it all the way to the end. Take a screenshot of who's left in your group, and give me your screenshot, and I will give you points. It sounds cheesy, but it was really so much fun, and it makes you think about things that you don't think about because you like at the beginning of the game, and I have really diverted. I probably could have got through this whole section in one class, but we're not. It's going to take 2. At the very beginning, they give you an amount of money, and you have to buy everything that you're going to go. And this is a spoiler. If you don't buy it in the beginning, it gets more expensive as you go. So kind of think of everything you're going to need because you know if you drive a new car, you don't think about things like this. But I have a new car now, or a newer car now. But when I was y'all's age, I drove POSs. That was, you learn to carry extra parts in your car. Well, that's what you had to do on the Oregon Trail too, because wheels break, yokes break, harnesses break. So it really is kind of neat. So play the game.
You can play the original on Internet Archive, and it was originally created in 1971.
Yeah, it was one of the first like computer games that you could play.
It's just where it's in like ABCD shows.
Yeah, but it's kind of fun. Now I have completely lost my train of thought. Okay, so we moved west. We talked about the Santa Fe Trail a little bit. The Oregon Trail went from Independence, Missouri to the Willamette River Valley. So 2,000 miles, it would take approximately 6 months. And there were, like I said, by 1845, about 5,000 people going across annually. Now, there are other people who are involved in this. The Indians. Unfortunately for the Indians, and this is kind of a repeat of what has happened in the East, most of the time when you talk about Indians, this is the group people are thinking of, the Western Indians. But what we did to the Western Indians, we had done to the Eastern Indians already. They don't realize that they're not going to stop coming. So the first few groups that come through, they're nice enough. They're not necessarily threatening unless you get to the Comanches or Apaches who just are hateful to begin with. They were just very warlike. Hateful is not the right word. They were very warlike tribes. But for a lot of the people traveling west, they're encounters with Indians were more likely to be where the Indians were demanding or begging for food, particularly after like 1846, 1847. There's a drought period that's going to make living on the western frontier really rough. And you add that to the already bad economic, which of course the economic depression doesn't affect the Indians, but it's pushing more people west. But they're starting to harass the settlers. In 1851, the government invites pretty much any Indian that will listen to come to Fort Laramie to discuss relationships. About 10,000 Indians show up. A lot of different tribes are represented. They meet. The chiefs are given lots of gifts. There's lots of alcohol. And a treaty is signed that is going to, by the terms of the treaties, the Indians are going to quit harassing the settlers, allow federal forts in exchange for cash payments, annual cash payments, and they agree to live in areas of limited extent and well-defined boundaries. It's basically a precursor to the reservation system. Not everybody agreed, but a lot of the bigger tribes, the more powerful tribes, the Sioux will sign and then immediately say, oh, no, we didn't mean it. We're not going to live by that. But it sets the pattern. This is going to be the pattern that we go by with people living, or the Indians being limited in area. Of course, fairly soon after that, we're going to find gold in the Black Hills, which is going to immediately negate, because this limited area and well-defined boundaries was also supposed to apply to the settlers who had to stay out of those areas. And that's where we're going to have some issues later on. So let's get through the Donner Party, and then, because I can do the Donner Party in 5 minutes. So I mentioned cannibalism earlier. And the Donner Party is just one of those interesting things to talk about. It's really not all that important, but it illustrates some of the issues that settlers had, and some of the problems that people face. Now, the Donner Party was led by 62-year-old George Donner of Illinois. He decides to set out in 1846, and he has 86 people in his caravan that's going to go. Now, he leaves Independence, Missouri late. And this is an issue. You had to leave sometime between, if you left in March, it was still too cold. But you had to leave before like the end of May. Yeah, you had to leave like before the end of May, or by the time you crossed the desert and you were getting back into the mountains, it's going to be too cold. Winter is going to start hitting because it's going to take you about 6 months to cross the country. But Donner thinks he can make up the time. They're only like about 2-3 weeks late in leaving, and they decide to go. Okay, so that's mistake number 1. He leaves late. Mistake number 2 is he hears of a shortcut through the Wasatch Mountains, and their goal is California. He hears of this shortcut and gets lost. So that doesn't help. He also had lost about 100 oxen in the desert. Because it was hotter than they planned, the drought is starting, and they weren't well prepared. So they get to Truckee Pass, which is the last major pass between the Rocky Mountains and California. And there's already 2 weeks of snowfall on the ground. Now, you can't push the wagons through. So they set up 2 camps. They have a month's supply of food. 17 of the strongest people decide that they're going to push on and go get help. Like 3 days in to for these 17 people, about 3 days into their push towards Sacramento, one man dies and he tells his daughters, "You're going to have to eat my body to survive." So they drag Daddy along for a day, and then they decide Daddy was right. So by the time they get to the Sacramento River Valley, there's only seven of the 17 left. They get help. They go back. When they get back to where the first camp was, they said it was ugly. They had already eaten all the animals. They had boiled and eaten anything that was made of leather. And then they had moved on to the people who were succumbing to hunger and illness. 13 had died. There were 47 survivors. I mean, it had gotten to the point in their camp that it was so acceptable. One woman had actually written in her journal, "I think I'll start on milk tomorrow." I mean, that's just how they survived. George Donner would not face what he had done. He stayed behind his wife. They both froze in the mountains. They didn't go back with the other 45. So it was not a safe trip. There was a lot of dangers, and it wasn't just, that the Indians might get you. There was cholera. There were rocks falling. There were floods. There were rivers. There was freezing. There was heat. There were a lot of issues, and the Donner Party kind of is the poster child for the worst possible things that could happen to you. We'll talk about John Fremont on. Okay, remember, no class on Monday. I'll see you again on Wednesday.
And you're gonna send us the flag next year.
I will send you the flag thing today. Promise I will post it before I go to bed. And if anybody wants to give me a quote by next Wednesday, I'll give you credit for that too.
Oh, the transcendental.
Yeah. You too. Okay, so this was an extra credit I offered.
I remember
during the
you
last
said
class.
something about it, but I didn't hear what quote.
Okay, any transcendentalist quote.
Okay.
Find a quote by a transcendentalist, and then tell me why you chose that quote.
Okay.
And just type it out so I can read.
Okay.